Christian. How many Christians do we have here? So you see, I also call myself a Christian nationalist.
Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan. Today I'm going to talk to you about the rise of religious nationalism globally. But before we talk about why religious nationalism is on the ascendance, not just in many countries, but also in many faith traditions, I would like you to subscribe to Khanversations if you have not already done so. Please remember to ring the bell icon, like the video, and share it with your friends and students and colleagues. Some of my videos are useful as discussion openers in classrooms. I use them in my own classroom to start conversations, like I will use this video to initiate a conversation about religious nationalism and nationalism per se. So make sure that you try to use Khanversations in your classrooms as much as you can. So what is nationalism? Before we understand what is religious nationalism, let's understand nationalism itself. Nationalism is not an ideology, it is a phenomena. It is a social phenomena that has occurred nearly everywhere in the world, and it can first be detected, according to historians, at the beginning of the French Revolution in the late 18th century. What the French Revolution really did is to move away from thinking about people as subjects of a particular empire, a particular dynasty, a particular ruler, or a particular principality. So rather than being the subject of the Emperor of France or subject of the Pope or the Ottoman Emperor, the French Revolution started talking about the people of France as the French nation, and you became member of a collective, and the ruler or the emperor or the king was also just a member of that collective as you are. So in that sense, developing beyond the ideas of popular sovereignty advanced by the French philosopher Rousseau, this idea of nationalism emerged. And so by most of the middle 19th century, this idea of nationalism has spread across Europe. And after the end of World War I, with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the idea of national self-determination was enshrined as an international principle that has to be respected by all people. We started talking about nations as if nations had equal rights, and all nations had equal rights to exist as an independent country. So nationalism was this phenomenon. It is a modern way of belonging to a political community. Once a particular nation was attached to a particular territory, it became a nation state, and you as an individual who belonged to that particular nation became a citizen of that nation state. So in that sense, we should think of nationalism as a political phenomena of belonging. It developed a new way of belonging to a political community. I identify at least three different types of nationalisms. As I said in the beginning, nationalism is not an ideology by itself, and therefore it tends to rely on different types of ideologies to become a force in any given society. So the three different kinds of nationalism that I have identified, number one is ethnic and cultural nationalism. This is the most prominent one. You are German by ethnicity or language or shared tradition, or sometimes even by race. You could be French, you could be Persian, you could be an Arab. So you belong to a particular group that is distinct, recognized, and once you see yourself as a nation, then you begin to think about national self-determination and becoming an independent country. So one form of nationalism is based on this ethno-cultural identity. The second type of nationalism, which is rather new, is a nationalism that has emerged in multicultural, multi-ethnic societies like the United States and Australia and Canada, where people from different nationalities have come together. And the goal of this particular form of nationality is to find common ground where people find some other basis to define their belonging in a particular state. And so we could talk about rule of law, a shared social contract, a commitment to certain values such as freedom, democracy, equality, egalitarianism, individual rights, human rights. So countries like the United States and Canada, who are, ontologically speaking, multicultural, cannot espouse ethno nationalism, theoretically speaking, and therefore they have created a form of civic nationalism. You must realize that in order for a country to have a really robust ethno-national culture, it must be more or less homogeneous, and therefore diversity is a challenge to ethno-national, ethno-cultural nationalism. And the third kind of nationalism is the religious nationalism, where the identity that you belong to politically is shaped not by values of civic nationalism or not by ethnicity or language or shared history, but more by adherence to a particular religion and belonging or membership in a particular religious community. So these are the three types of nationalism which are manifest in contemporary politics, especially in the 20th and the 21st century. The 19th century was more or less about ethnocultural nationalism. Let's now look at some concrete examples of the three modes of nationalism that I have been discussing. But before I do that, if you have not already subscribed to Khanversations, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. One of the best examples of these three modes of nationalism can be seen in the emergence of the three countries in South Asia: India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Pakistan came into existence on the 14th of August 1947, about 75 years ago, and it was based on the idea that Muslims needed a separate homeland. If they continued to live in an independent India, they would be dominated by a Hindu majority, and in order to enjoy all their religious and other rights, they felt they needed to create a separate country for themselves. And so Pakistan became the first modern nation to be built on the idea of religious nationalism. A day later, India was born on the 15th of August 1947, and even though at that time some people thought of India as Hindu and Pakistan as Muslim, India had a significant Muslim minority, probably more than the number of Muslims in Pakistan. So India chose to be a secular, democratic, and socialist nation, and its idea of unity in spite of diversity essentially compelled India to take the path of civic nationalism, to build a nation based on ideas rather than ethnicity or religion. And then in 1971, Pakistan was divided into Pakistan and Bangladesh, and the emergence of Bangladesh essentially said that sometimes language and ethnicity can trump over religious identity. And so even though Bangladesh was a Muslim majority country, it chose to separate from Pakistan. And so Bangladeshi nationalism is an example of linguistic and nationalism. So you can see all the three modes of nationalism manifest so remarkably in South Asia: India as a civic nationalist nation, Pakistan as a religious nationalist nation, in Bangladesh based on secular but linguistic nationalism. I use a textbook to teach this class on contemporary political ideologies, and that textbook is Andrew Haywood's Political Ideologies, an introduction. This is one of the older editions. I still like that. And in that, while discussing nationalism, Andrew Haywood essentially points to four different traditions of nationalism. He calls them the liberal tradition, the conservative tradition, the expansionist nationalism, and the post-colonial nationalism. He argues that the nationalism that emerged out of France after the French Revolution, especially in the 1790s, and as it spread all over Europe, especially in Germany and Italy, this was a liberal tradition which talks about individuals as subjects of popular sovereignty, where everybody is equal and are a member of a particular nation. And so it was very liberal in that sense. And eventually, the conservatives who initially opposed this liberal tradition then began to realize that nationalism was something that could be employed in the service of conservative traditions. And so even conservatives such as the Tsar of Russia and others also embraced the idea of nationalism and tried to foster this identity of belonging to a particular nation state, even though they did not adopt all the aspects of liberal traditions which would have led to democratization. Nevertheless, conservative traditions did employ and borrow the idea of nationalism. The third kind of nationalism that he talks about is expansionist nationalism, and we saw a lot of this in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when industrialized nations in Europe essentially used nationalism to motivate people to essentially go out into the underdeveloped world or into Africa and Asia and colonize these countries. And one of the impetus was national competition between European countries. It was considered a source of national pride to have a large number of colonies. At the time this is being recorded, the Commonwealth Games are taking place, and that is another sign of what you could say vestigial expansionist nationalism, where the expansion of territorial boundaries, a source of pride for the country, a source of pride for the members of the country, for the citizens, became the basis for imperial expansion for many European nations. And in fact, you could argue that Russia's, at least some people do make the case, that Russia's invasion in Ukraine at the moment is a form of expansionist nationalism. Russia sees itself as much bigger than the territorial boundaries it enjoys, and so it wants to expand beyond its current territorial boundaries as a form of defending its nationalist vision of what Russia really is. The post-colonial nationalism essentially emerged primarily after the Second World War, in which countries which had been occupied by expansionist nationalist nations adopted European ideas of nationalism and started seeking national self-determination against their colonial rulers. And so the modern developing nations, then essentially the post-colonial nation states, essentially adopted a form of nationalism which is against imperialism, against colonization, against Western and European domination. Even as post-colonial states, they continue to remain in the orbit of their previous occupiers and previous colonizers. Nevertheless, their idea of what their nation is something of a post-colonial idea. In fact, one of the best examples is India. The very idea of India as a country emerged in India's independence movement, and so what we define as India today exists as a post-colonial reality and is a product of post-colonial nationalism. In the past few years, we have witnessed the emergence of religious nationalism as a global phenomenon. Take a look at these four countries: India, the United States, Israel, and Pakistan. Israel and Pakistan are like twins. They were the first two countries to be created out of religious nationalist movement. Pakistan emerged as a dream of a segment of Indian Muslims who wanted sovereignty over their own territory, who did not want to either share sovereignty with Hindus or live under Hindu sovereignty, and wanted to be independent. They wanted a Muslim homeland, and so they created Pakistan, the first example of a religious and national state. And then a year later, in May 1948, Israel became an independent state, which was essentially created by a religious nationalist movement called Zionism. The Zionists felt that the only thing that could keep Jews safe, they had just suffered a tremendous experience of the Holocaust, where nearly 6 million Jews were massacred in perhaps the greatest act of crime committed by any nation in the world. It was committed by Germany, the Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews. So that really compelled and motivated the Jewish diaspora to come together and create a Jewish state based on Jewish nationalism. The very idea that they needed a state which would not only protect Jews but who lived within its boundaries, but also would protect Jews who lived in other parts of the world. And so Israel became the second state which was the product of religious nationalism. It continues to remain very strongly committed to this idea of the religious nationalism. So one of the things that they demand in their negotiations with the Palestinians who are seeking a homeland for themselves, the Palestinian homeland would be, when it comes into existence, a product of secular ethno-national movement for statehood, unless you have an Islamic state emerging in Gaza, which would then be a product of religious nationalism. But the demands that Israel makes, that Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state, as one of the conditions for peace, shows that the idea of religious nationalism is still powerful in Israel. But look at the other two countries, India and the United States, which are experiencing religious nationalism. They have existed, both of them, as states which are based on civic nationalism, democracy, secularism, equality, pluralism, religious freedom, human rights. All of these were the values on the basis of which these two countries existed. But now you see strong movements in these two countries. In the US, white Christian nationalism, and perhaps they had their first president of recent times in Donald Trump. And what we saw on January 6th, the siege of the US Capitol, the siege of US democracy, really, by white Christian nationalists, essentially shows that this movement is gaining power and influence, and people are there, both in the elite, in the Republican Party, and in the masses, who are willing to compromise secularism, who are willing to compromise democracy in order to create a white Christian America. And so we can see a lot of historical rewriting taking place, where more and more people are coming out and making the case that America was created based on Christian values for white people. And so we can see the emergence of white Christian nationalism. The American version of religious nationalism, like everything American, has racial undertones. And so therefore the religious nationalism that we are witnessing, the rise of which we are witnessing in America, is also tainted by racism. In India, what we see is that along with the civic nationalism, there emerged religious nationalism with the existence of the Arya Samaj movement, the RSS, etc., even in the early 20th century. And now with the election of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, 2014, continues to be the Prime Minister. This is his second term. We can see that Hindu nationalists are in power. But is India a Hindu state yet? No, constitutionally speaking, it is still a secular and socialist state, whereas the ruling party is majoritarian, Hindutva oriented, which is Hindu nationalist, and more of a right-wing state. So essentially, all the values that the ruling party essentially espouses are contradictory to what is in the preamble of the Indian Constitution, what is the fundamental values of the Indian Constitution, which is secularism, socialism, and essentially democracy. So we see the emergence of these religious movements. Both India and the United States are very robust democracies. People in the West think Israel is a democracy. Israel also is a state which practices apartheid like laws and apartheid like rules with regards to the Palestinians who live in the territories it occupies. And Pakistan, both of them are sort of democracies, but India and the United States are very robust democracies. And so they are still pushing back against religious nationalism. And it is quite possible that in the near future in India, I, I, I don't see the possibility in the United States yet that religious nationalism will triumph. So it is quite likely that religious nationalism will take hold in the biggest democracy in the world, and India might become a Hindu Rashtra, both in the de jure sense and de facto sense. Right now, it's a de facto Hindu Rashtra, but constitutionally it is not. And with the taste for constitutional reforms that the current Bharatiya Janata Party has acquired, it's quite possible that if they win a third term, they will make more constitutional changes in India and move it towards becoming a de jure Hindu nation. The possibility of that happening in the U.S. Is less likely. The democratic institutions in the U.S. are very robust, very strong, and the opposition, I think a majority of Americans are opposed to white Christian nationalism. Nationalism, while can be a very powerful force that can transform a country, take it down a path of democratization and development and cohesion, it works best in countries which are more or less homogeneous, have people who are very similar in language, in culture, in race, in ethnicity, but in societies which are multicultural, multi-religious, extremely diverse, it is important to recognize that no other form of nationalism other than civic nationalism can preserve the rights of all, preserve democracy, preserve secularism. So I hope you found this discussion of nationalism and the types of nationalisms that exist in the world, and also the rise of religious nationalism, a good conversation starter. This was not intended to be a comprehensive lecture on each of these things. The purpose of this is essentially to basically touch upon the key issues. So this is Muqtedar Khan, host of Khanversations, signing off. But before I do that, don't forget to subscribe to Khanversations. Until next time.